Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tenpenny Files. I'm your host, Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. Here on the Tenpenny Files, we dive into vital and sometimes controversial discussions on topics that will challenge what you've been told and reveal what has been hidden. These compelling conversations will make you think, spark debate, and hopefully inspire action. Join me each day, Monday through Friday, here on AmericaOutloud.news or on iHeartRadio to hear from authors and documentary filmmakers have something important to say, but have often been silenced or censored. Today's conversation is with my guest, Shaz Khan, author of The Ultimate Vaccine Timeline, I'll start that over again. I'll have her cut that out. Today's conversation is with my guest, Shaz Khan, author of The Ultimate Vaccine Timeline, a fact-packed history of vaccines and their makers, an absolutely amazing book and compilation of facts that I'm telling you, I don't think another book about vaccines need to be written. It's just the most incredible book I think I have in my library about vaccines at all. So Shaz, thank you so much for being on the Tenpenny File, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, you mentioned at the very beginning of your book that the book was dedicated to your father, whose death triggered your deep dive into vaccines. Tell us about your journey of how you got started with this.
I'm not a medical professional or a scientist. I'm not even a parent, so vaccines weren't on my radar whatsoever. But in 2015, very soon, about 2 months after a flu shot, my father died in hospital, diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And just things didn't add up for me because, from my understanding, anybody who had lung cancer, and I've seen people with lung cancer, they have respiratory issues. They come into the hospital with primary respiratory issues, but his issues seemed to be all neurological, and he was given steroids for brain lesions, but he didn't have brain cancer. So I'm not saying that the flu vaccine, killed him. Obviously, I had never have will have any proof for that, but I certainly was convinced that it accelerated his demise. And I started asking questions. The first thing I did was went and looked at the package insert, and I was pretty horrified to find out that flu vaccines are acknowledged to have neurological side effects. And, from as serious as Guillain-Barré syndrome to encephalitis. And this was written in the package insert. So that kind of instigated me to go down the rabbit hole of vaccines. I never planned on writing a book on it, but the more information I started discovering in the libraries and the archives that I realized weren't being divulged to the public, I realized that I had to put it into a format that I could share with people.
Well, you know, once you start investigating this, were you surprised? I mean, what was your viewpoint on vaccines before you took a deep dive into this deep rabbit hole? And how have things changed since you've done all this research?
Well, I was pretty naive to be quite honest. I was a little bit more critical of allopathic medicine and its reductionist view of health in general at that point. I still thought some like vaccines were untouchable. They saved us from polio and smallpox and I believed what I was told about vaccines. And the last vaccines I took, I didn't ask any questions of my doctor and just rolled up my sleeve and got them. So I had questions, but I really didn't approach it from a skeptical point of view. It was more like, hang on a minute, I didn't know that you could have neurological injuries following vaccines. What other problems can you have? And that's when I deep dived into primarily the DTP shot as being one of the most recognized vaccines that have been creating neurological problems since the get-go, basically, since it came out in 1947. And the more I discovered, the more I found out in the archives, because I started reading books, obviously. 2015, the first book I wrote was, I read was Dissolving Illusions by Dr. Suzanne Humphreys and Roman Mistrionik, which I have to admit I had problems believing some of the content in there. So that's why I went to the libraries and I went to the archives to get firsthand documentation from government documents. And I was pretty shocked. I mean, I started in Switzerland here, where I'm based in Bern, and I found documents from as early as 1946 that recognized encephalitis following the smallpox vaccine and compensated people who died following encephalitis. And that was the last time Switzerland actually had a mandate. And I realized the reason why we don't have mandates in Switzerland is because the government doesn't want to take responsibility for the injuries because they have to pay out compensation. So I very quickly realized that the information that we're told about vaccines being safe and effective is misleading at best, and I would say blatant disinformation. Actually, that's where I would put it at the moment. It's either ignorance, people continue to say that without actually having looked at the historical research, or they're just blatantly trying to just persuade people to get vaccinated no matter what and not ask any questions because people don't like having to answer these difficult questions.
When you were going to the libraries and getting into those old archives, did you have to get special permission to get to some of those documents?
In the UK, I had to get some freedom of information requests activated to be able to access documents from like the 1980s because they were closed. I didn't know that the Committee of Safety of Medicines, which is basically like I would say the ASIP in the US, they closed their documents for about 80 to 100 years, so they remain classified. So you have to put in an official request to get access to it. And there are lots of documents I didn't get access to, like the work compensation schemes of health professionals. I didn't get access to on the basis that it had personal information in it, but they could have blackened it out. But anyway, in the National Archives, yes, I had to get permission to access some of the documents that were closed, but the documents that were open already, that were declassified, I had no issue getting to. The Swiss archives, I had no problems with getting to the documents because they were from the 40s. At that point, they already were declassified. But it was easier to find documents in the National Archives in the UK than it was in Switzerland. Switzerland, it's all in German. German's not my best language, so but I still managed to find enough information to be quite concerned about what was not being disclosed to the public, which is a history of neurological injury since the dawn of vaccines themselves. And we're talking about the smallpox vaccine, which wasn't even injected, to remind people that it was scraped onto the skin, like with a lancet. So it wasn't actually injected underneath the skin, but still was causing neurological problems, still was causing all kinds of infections. Obviously, it was during a time that we didn't have, wide use of antibiotics and antiseptics. So lots of infections, necrosis, even leprosy could be a side effect of the smallpox vaccine. But yeah, I mean, some of the documents, I still am looking forward to getting some of the documents from the 90s, especially with regards to the MMR, which might be a little bit tricky getting access to at the National Archives. But in theory, anybody can get access, make a request, and then hopefully it will be honored.
In your book, in addition to doing the research on all of the vaccines, and you go all the way back to the beginning, and you follow one of the things about your book that I find fascinating, because I tried to do some of this myself and I just got exacerbated with it. I just said no, exasperated with it. I said I can't do this. Is when you were following the pharmaceutical industry of this company made this vaccine, and then it's like playing like playing Risk or something, where you're having to buy and sell properties, and you're moving them around, and then this company becomes this company's bought out by these two, and then it's bought back by the original. I find it fascinating that you were able to track all of that. How did you do that?
But that again was a lot of research, and I actually started the timeline with the pharmaceutical industry because that was where I was getting frustrated because I couldn't find out what companies had bought up which companies, which portfolios had been bought up by other companies. I mean, I have to give credit to Wikipedia. They do a reasonable job of trying to track mergers and acquisitions of like the primary vaccine manufacturers, this as being just GSK, Sanofi, uh, Merck and Pfizer now. So they do a pretty good job of it, but I really wanted to find out all these old companies like Park Davis, which was one of the biggest ones, Boris Wellcome, obviously was the biggest one. It's now GSK. There were lots more companies back in the days that got bought up by these other companies, which I found it hard to find. So basically, that was just digging into old press articles, into old books, in libraries, in pharmaceutical journals, trying to find out, literally track mergers when they were announced. Uh, Mérieux was also a pretty complicated one to follow, which bought up Pasteur and now has become Sanofi, and to find out whose portfolio went to who, because Eli Lilly, for example, got out of vaccine business in the 1970s, 1980s, but they sold off some vaccines to other companies, but not all of them. So they sold off some to Wyeth that became Pfizer. They managed to keep the license for merthiolate, which is mercury, which was the preservative used in a lot of the vaccines, the inactivated vaccines, still used in multi-dose flu vaccines and in the vaccines for children in developing countries. People seem to think thimerosal is taken out of all the vaccines, but it's still in vaccines we give to kids in India and Africa. So, so yeah, that was basically a lot of research. I went in quite naively thinking, oh, I'll finish that in a couple of weeks. But again, the more you dig into these kinds of subjects, the more you can get lost in all the information. And again, it's not supposed to be a fully exhaustive timeline that I've got in my book with regards to the pharmaceutical industry, but I try to focus on all the companies related to production of vaccines, which then from the 1970s and the 1980s involved a lot of biotech companies. So that was kind of like a new thing where you had pharmaceutical companies making arrangements and deals with biotech for specific ingredients or specific technology to produce genetically modified vaccines, which is pretty much now what the market is primarily consisted of.
Genetically modified vaccines, they're mostly are what it's in the market now? Tell
Yeah,
us.
most they'll have ingredients. Like the whole thing won't necessarily be genetically engineered, but I give the example of the MMR is it doesn't use human albumin anymore. It uses a recombinant albumin, which actually is owned by a UK company. So they have to license that albumin as a separate ingredient in the MMR. And there are lots of examples of genetically engineered yeast, obviously for the hepatitis B vaccine. There'll be components. So it's not necessarily the virus that is genetically engineered, which is the case for a lot of vaccines like HPV. Obviously, COVID, not even going to talk about that because it's not a typical vaccine. But yeah, absolutely. Because that's
Wow.
what allows them to get patents.
You also mentioned thimerosal in passing, and when you were doing your research, you also looked into the development and the timeline of the other adjuvants and the things that they trialed and kind of went away. Tell us a little bit about the development of vaccine adjuvants.
So it's interesting. I expected to find more science on adjuvants, but there actually wasn't that much. As soon as they kind of like came out with using aluminum salts in the late 1920s, thimerosal was used primarily as a preservative, not necessarily an adjuvant, but aluminum salts was used as an adjuvant. And that didn't actually evolve much until like the 1960s was the next point that I found that they started using peanut oil. So adjuvant 65, which belonged to Merck, was a proprietary adjuvant where they were using oil and water adjuvants or oil and water emulsions, sorry, which were very reactogenic and sometimes way too reactogenic for them to actually use them in human vaccines. They tended to use them more in animal vaccines. And it wasn't until like 97 in Europe where they then licensed again a proprietary adjuvant, which was an oil and water based adjuvant for influenza vaccine, I believe it was. And it came out in the US a bit later. But up until that point, it's only been aluminum salts. There have also been mineral salts, calcium phosphate, which was used in France. And I was Pasteur Institute with Institut Marieux, who used it in their DTP shots. Now, their DTP shots are DTP-P for polio, because those were the main vaccines that were obligatory, but they stopped using that pretty quickly. I don't know why, because it's still recognized as an official adjuvant today by the WHO, and it could be replaced, could replace the aluminum salts, but historically it's like they found the aluminum salts, they worked really well, they didn't really understand why they worked, but they were super cheap, but they just stuck with them. And the next thing that came out with proprietary adjuvants, where independent researchers can't even get access to the formulations to analyze them themselves because they're proprietary. And we know that about AHS, amorphous aluminum. Oh, sorry about the actual abbreviation escapes me, but AHS, which is in HPV vaccine, also in one of it's Vaxelis, which is a 6-in-1 vaccine by Sanofi. You can't get access to these adjuvants for independent analysis because they belong to the companies who are making them. So, but it's surprising that there haven't been more development in adjuvants up until like the late 90s and then the beginning of the 2000s.
It's interesting that even if you read a paper that was published in 2024 or 2025 on aluminum, or something to do with an aluminum adjuvant, or if they were looking at the biometric properties of the aluminum, it usually starts out in the first couple of paragraphs of the study saying, we've been using aluminum salts since the 1920s. We still don't know how they work. We still don't know why they're in vaccines, but they seem to create more antibodies. We don't know what it kind of does. We don't know much about it, and we still don't know how they work. And you think about the millions upon millions of children, babies around the world that have been injected with a metal that they don't have any idea how it works. or what they're doing with it. But they just, it's just repetition. Just because we've always done it, that's the way we're always going to continue to do it. And
Mm.
I just find that really shocking every time I read something about aluminum. And speaking of shocking, as you were doing your research, I mean, starting from just a package insert and then just going deeper and deeper, because that's kind of how this stuff, when you start researching vaccines, it's like it's like an obsession. It just takes you deeper and deeper and deeper. And I know when I first started investigating vaccines after September of 2000, I just kept thinking sooner or later, and I know Aaron Siri, who's written the books Vaccines, Amen, he said the same thing. He just kept digging deeper because he thought surely that you would soon come across the study that would explain why they do this and that it has validity and that it really is safe and it really does protect children and keep them from getting sick. And you just thinking that around the next corner, you're going to find that study and it's not, and you never do because it's not there. And you just keep going into more and more rabbit holes. What do you think of all the time? You told me once this took you about 10 years to put this timeline together.
Yeah, it's 10 years worth of research and actual about 5 years worth of actually putting it together in a readable format. Because as I said, I had no plans on writing a book about it. It was just pure personal research for I had spare time and I'm a geek and I like to read and I like to spend time in the libraries. But I never imagined I would go down this rabbit hole. And as you said, it becomes obsessive because for me, I mean, I'm not a parent, but I imagined as a parent, I would have been the first person to say, hang on a minute, why would I inject anything into my kids that hasn't been scientifically proven to make them healthier? Because that's what my concern is at the end of the day. Because even if measles vaccines prevents measles, I don't really care about preventing measles if it means they're going to have other chronic issues down the line. And this was something I didn't understand, this benefit risk thing. Why would you risk a 1 week, 2 week infection, which in most countries we can deal with? We know I've had measles. It's no fun, but it's definitely not, like a chronic disease for the rest of your life. Why were we, offsetting that with potential autoimmune diseases, neurodevelopmental disorders? So it became an obsession for me. And also I think for me, I was very trusting of the government, very trusting of the authorities, very trusting of people in public health, telling me that vaccines are safe and effective and they saved us from polio and from smallpox. So I got angry when I started researching and when I started finding out that government documents were actually disclosing the amount of neurological injuries in babies after vaccination that wasn't disclosed en masse. I mean, I'm all for informed consent, but how can you make an informed choice if you're not given the full story? So that's definitely how I went about it, and I got more obsessed. And there's a lot of information about vaccines because there's some, we've got 200 years worth of information on vaccines, and I was shocked at how many vaccines we already had in the beginning of the 20th century. Because I thought, okay, we had tetanus, we had diphtheria, we had smallpox. We had vaccines against acne back in the days before they had any kind of, regulation or checking. Basically, the market was awash with whatever, manufacturers could bring to market. So that included flu vaccines. Obviously, they weren't viral based, they were based on bacteria because we didn't have the notion of viruses back then. And yeah, we had gonorrhea vaccines, uh, as I said, acne. I think there was even a vaccine against the common cold. A lot of these disappeared as soon as the regulations and the more stringent demands came into place from public health, but it still didn't get rid of a lot of the products that we don't see today. Excuse me. And obviously today now we have just lots of combo vaccines, which back in the days, the first one that came out was DTP. There was also a smallpox combined with measles that didn't last very long because I think it was they noticed that it was quite not so safe. But the DTP vaccine has been on the market for since 1947. And it was only changed the formulation from the whole cell, which was incredibly reactogenic, to the acellular pertussis in the 90s. But it's recognized to be way less effective. But why are we still giving that to babies and to pregnant women? Pregnant women are also getting aluminum shots for God knows what reason. Uh, yeah, there's a lot of obsessive qualities that comes with researching the subject, even if you have no skin in the game, which for me is the case, because as I said, I don't have children. No one was forcing me to get vaccinated for my job. And here in Switzerland, we don't have any mandates like most European countries. There are some mandates for like polio in Belgium, and France has got 11 vaccines, but France has just created a way more skeptical public now of vaccines because of those mandates.
Did you ever find in any of your research, because I've looked for this for a long time and I just recently started looking for it again, why they decided to put together tetanus, pertussis, and tetanus, and diphtheria? Why they decided to make a combination vaccine? All I could find in my research was suddenly they just started putting diphtheria and tetanus together. And then they thought, well, maybe we'll just throw in pertussis because it's, children, parents are more likely to get their children vaccinated with one vaccine as opposed to three. But I could find nothing in terms of what the thought process was, if they considered safety, if they considered whether or not that they would fight each other as adjuvants. Did you find anything about that?
I have to admit, I couldn't find any sound, solid scientific argument as to why they put those three together. But as you said, they did combine the diphtheria and pertussis together and tetanus and pertussis together. And I remember in my research, now this isn't in the book, but I do remember that them coming up as an argument that because people did not want to get multiple doses of vaccines because they were reactogenic, especially the pertussis one. People knew pertussis was reactogenic from day one. It came out in 1914. People seem to think that it came out later, but the first pertussis vaccines available alone came out in 1914. And already from then, people didn't want to get them for their kids because they knew they were reactogenic. They put them together to kind of incentivize people to say, hang on, you want tetanus? Well, you have to get pertussis as well because they're together. And that kind of masked as well the reactogenicity of the pertussis component because it was harder for the people to say, hey, well, I know it's the pertussis component that's creating problems, even though we knew later on that that's exactly what happened and the people were aware of that, that it wasn't the tetanus component that was particularly reactogenic or the diphtheria, it was pertussis. So I think it was more of a practicality aspect. They brought it together and also to mask the reactogenicity, sorry, of the pertussis component, and to and trying to encourage people to get this vaccine because whooping cough. I mean, obviously back in the days it was a concern. They didn't look at any other factors as to why it happened and other treatments that were could have helped kids who were having whooping cough, but they really did want to try and get people to inject their kids with this.
I've recently heard a clip from Dr. Suzanne Humphreys talking about treating kids with pertussis. And she had this boy that came into her office a couple of years ago. He was 7 years old. And she said she was really afraid because he was so sick. She really thought he might die, that his skin was purple. He was really struggling to breathe and he just looked terrible. So she started an IV on him. And her regular protocol is 500 milligrams of vitamin C per pound of body weight and over like 2 to 3 hours. And so she started this IV, and within the first hour, his skin color changed. And within the second hour, he just sat up and started talking to people. By the third article, through the hour, he was almost completely well and sitting there playing with his phone. And she said, my whole staff, everybody was just like mesmerized by this. And she said, then I got really angry because she said, I'm thinking, it's this simple. I mean, pertussis is really about just getting adequate vitamin C into the body that will fight the bacteria and the infection that you had. She goes, I was really, really angry after that. And there's so many of these infections. I'm really watching my language to try to stop calling them diseases because they're not diseases. And I think that the entire healthcare industry created an oxymoron by calling things infectious disease. Because it's not really a disease, it's an infection. It's something that comes and goes, is generally treatable, and you're better in 10 to 14 days for the vast majority of people. And so it's really not a good thing at all. We've got just a couple of minutes here, just 2 minutes before our first break. What would you say is the most shocking piece of information that you have found in your research?
Well, the piece of information that actually inspired me to actually put this information in a book was actually from the UK archives. It was a document from 1977, which I know I was the first person to look at because I accessed it through a Freedom of Information request. And basically, it was the government authorities, so the the Royal Commission on Civil Liability, sorry, that admitted that screaming to fits was a sign of brain damage. Now, if I could tell you the amount of parents I've heard talk about this high-pitched scream that they talk about after vaccination, that made me think of that immediately. And that the government documents behind closed doors were admitting that that was a sign of brain damage. That really, really pissed me off, and I found that quite shocking. And actually, the document is in the book. They had the handwritten notes to edit it out so that it read differently. Obviously, not to alert the public and not to scare the public into not getting they were talking about the DTP shot at this point. This is the whooping cough vaccine. So that really shocked me, and that was probably one of the reasons why I decided I had to write a book and put this documentation in it.
Well, it is one of the most thoroughly written, well-researched, well-documented books I think I've ever seen. Seriously, it is an amazing book. So Shaz Khan, we're going to take a really quick break here to hold on to that thought. There's more to come to talk about your research and the other things that you found. We're taking a short break today, right now, to talk about AmericaOutloud.news. And America Out Loud Talk Radio plays the 10 Penny Files on iHeartRadio Network daily, Monday through Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. You can also listen anywhere in the world if you go to AmericaOutloud.news and use their media player, not only to hear the 10 Penny Files, but the other great authors and podcasters that are on that show. If you've missed any of our great conversations, you can find the 10 Penny Files on Spotify, Pandora, Apple, iTunes, iHeart Virtual Studio, and you can find them on my platform if you go to dr10penny.com or dr10penny.substack.com. Because there's so many really good books and documentaries out there and so little time to read and watch, this show is meant to maximize your time, jumpstart your interest, and expose you to topics and information that maybe you've always wanted to learn about but never had the time, or hopefully things that you didn't even know existed, and we're going to enlighten you and brighten up your mind to something that's new and challenging to understand and learn. So sit tight. We will be right back. There's more to come. Zeolite is a detox spray. We work specifically with a company called Touchstone Essentials. They are an incredible company. We've been working with them now for several years. And zeolite is a mineral that goes through your body like a one-way basket. It will clean out heavy metals such as arsenic and mercury, aluminum, cadmium, and it hooks onto those metals from a one-way perspective. So once it's bound, it goes out through your urine or your stools and doesn't get redeposited in other places. Everybody needs to have a detox product in their life, and this one is so easy to use and it's so safe. You can take it when you're pregnant, you can take it when you're nursing, you can give it to little children, you can even give it to infants, and quite frankly, I give it to my dog. I actually put a little bit of the zeolite in his water because until we all stop living in a toxic world, we all need to get some of those extra toxicities out, the heavy metals, the persistent organic pollutants, the things that are floating through the air, the different things that we come in touch with in our environment. And we are a big fan of zeolite from Touchstone Essentials. We've been a big fan of their products for several years. Go to dr10penny.com/detox to get your first bottle of zeolite spray for $50 off.
Well, only when the government bows to the people will America become great again. This is Malcolm Out Loud here. Join me in pushing back against censorship, my fellow Americans. Right at the top of AmericaOutloud.news are the words, many voices, one freedom, united in the First Amendment. Now is our time, my fellow Americans. AmericaOutloud.news, liberty and justice for all.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Today we're talking to Shaz Khan, the author of The Ultimate Vaccine Timeline, a fact-packed history of vaccines and their matters. And man, is it ever fact-packed. It is the most complete and incredible compendium of vaccine history I have ever seen. And if you missed the first part of our show, let me tell you just a little bit more about my guest, because she's a really amazing woman. Shaz Khan. Shaz is a London-born and lives in Switzerland. She graduated from Central St. Martin's College in Art and Design, and with a degree in product design. She went on to obtain certifications in nutrition, marketing and communications, anatomy and physiology, in immunobiology and vaccinology. She spent months in libraries and national archives. In fact, she spent over 10 years researching all this information, and she was disturbed to discover the undisclosed safety history of vaccines and the scope of injuries observed following their administration, which became her motivation to bring this information public. Shaz, it's just so great to see you again. You know, you took a vaccinology course in Oxford University in 2019. What were some of the noteworthy conversations that happened at that meeting?
I was going to say, I was actually quite surprised they accepted me, but anyway. Um, there were quite a few interesting conversations, but I think that the two ones that really stood out, one of them is regards to the flu shot, because obviously I went in there with disclosing my skepticism of the flu shot. And I was surprised to learn that pretty much everyone else in the class, we were about 20, 25 people in there from all different walks. There was a doctor, there was a regulatory affairs officer, there were immunologists. They agreed that the flu shot at best is 30% effective if you're lucky. And most people in that room did not get their flu shot. And I was really quite shocked by that admission by people who were in the field and for me, who I thought would defend the flu vaccine to the death, especially because at the time in the UK, we were giving it to pregnant women, giving it to pregnant women in Switzerland and the US, and putting it onto frontline workers. That if they don't get it, they have to wear a mask or like a badge, like, I didn't get the flu vaccine, kind of like a badge of shame. And I was standing there kind of, well, if the flu vaccine is only 30% effective if you're lucky, because let's remember the WHO is looking into a crystal ball and trying to estimate what kind of strain is going to be used in the northern or the southern hemisphere 6 months in advance so they can produce the vaccine. It's a guessing game. Why are we forcing it on frontline workers? Why are we advocating it for pregnant women? Why are we giving it to kids from 6 months old? And the answer I got back was it's better than nothing. And I kind of like was gobsmacked there, going, hang on a minute, sometimes it's better to do nothing than to potentially create a problem because I know a lot of people got sick after the flu vaccine. Now, a lot of them will say, oh, I would have been worse if I didn't have the flu vaccine. That's another bit of brainwashing. But could you give that to pregnant women? I found that really very concerning. The second thing that happened, that it wasn't me who brought it up. It was someone else. We were having lunch once around a table. There wasn't the whole class there, but I think we're about 12 of us around the table, and someone brought up Wakefield and the famous autism study, scam, fraud. And I listened to what people had to say, and it was quite interesting because there was one girl who was at the table who was a PhD student specializing in microbiome, actually in what they call shit transfers, fecal transplants, sorry. Um, and she admitted to having had the MMR vaccine, still having had measles, and she came out with a statement that said, and I'm pretty verbatim here, I much rather my kid has autism than measles. And when she said that, I was like, what? I mean, does she know what autism is? I mean, I'm not talking about, the glorified or the high functioning autism, which is made to look, somewhat, you're amazing. And yeah, there are lots of amazing autistic kids. But for most parents who I've seen who have got autistic kids, it destroys their family because, they have to give up their work. It's often a sacrifice of their couple. The other kids get neglected. I'd much rather have, 2 weeks of measles than a life of autism. But someone brought up the Wakefield study, and then there's one regulatory agency lady there who was saying, "Oh, it was horrible. Wakefield was a fraud. How could he have done that? Fraudified his data." And at this point, I had read the legal case against him, also the Walker Smith's appeal with the GMC, and obviously read the article that was published in the Lancet in '98, which was retracted after 12 years. Excuse me. I was shocked to discover that in this room of highly educated people, not a single person had actually read the original Lancet paper because he never claimed the MMR vaccine caused autism. And I was trying to state that. I was like, he never said that. He was making a link between, potential gut biosis and the intestinal syndromes with the anecdotal report of the parents saying that these symptoms started after the MMR vaccine. but he didn't make any link. He said they stated they couldn't make that link, but that it warranted further investigation. Nobody had read, obviously, the legal case against him, where he wasn't actually accused of fraudifying any data. He was charged with misconduct because of the apparently not disclosing the conflict of interest with the transfer factor, which wasn't in under his name only, but the Royal Free Hospital, for getting the blood samples from that birthday party, even though he had the parents' consent. He was never charged with fraudifying data. But nobody around that table actually knew any of the facts regarding the case. It was just repeating what they'd seen in the media, repeating what Brian Deere obviously reported in the Sunday Times, and what Fiona Godley of the British Medical Journal as well, the case against Wakefield. They basically propagated these lies to try and, I would say, dissuade any doctor from ever going down that path of questioning vaccines, which is what he was doing, and trying to make a scapegoat out of him, which to this day he still is. I mean, we're talking about a paper that was published in 98, and I believe it was retracted in 2010. And yet still to this day, people refer to, being Wakefielded. So this was surprising for me to come, at a place like University of Oxford with people who I imagined had a high level of intelligence, and yet none of them had read the original paper. Everyone was quite content to just repeat what they'd had read in the British Medical Journal or in the Sunday Times, and no one had bothered to actually get to the facts of the matter. So that really kind of like blew a bubble as far as my esteem for people in this institution and people with PhDs. Like, well, if they can't even read it, like the Lancet paper is not that long to read it. And even though it's been retracted, I would still think out of an interest, anybody who thinks that he was a fraud should read it, because they should actually read what he wrote. So yeah, those two things that really stood out with me. I mean, I had the whole AstraZeneca team there in 2019, so this is before the COVID vaccine, obviously, but they used the same platform for the flu vaccine as they used for the AstraZeneca COVID Shield vaccine. And Sarah Gilbert was there, Adrian Hill, sorry, who was there. All these people who were, key people in development of the vaccine. And I can tell you, especially Sarah Gilbert, did not give a very, what's the word? Not very human vibe. She was not very compassionate as a person. And I mean, again, no judgment, but this was something I observed, which I found concerning, that people who were supposedly really concerned with public health and saving lives, yet seemed to be devoid of any kind of compassion. This is something I noticed about Sarah Gilbert, especially. And again, I think that I'm maybe digressing from your question, but it did stand out to me. It's something that I noticed is a bit weird. And in general, like I really surprised that the level. Like, I had a great teacher of immunology. Like, you could tell she was a fantastic teacher, really passionate about what she was teaching. And I was one of the annoying students in the front row asking lots of questions. And one of them was, well, which is something I noticed in my research, is the technology of vaccination has become a lot more sophisticated. Like, that's for sure. But the premise stays the same as it did 200 years ago, which is we're trying to trick the body into thinking it has an infection, so it creates antibodies for protection against a future exposure. That hasn't really developed much in the last 200 years. And I asked the immunologist, I was like, we know that the immune system doesn't operate in independence, in isolation of the nervous system, of the digestive system, of the endocrine system. Yet when we talk about vaccines, we only look at the immune system. How is that possible in this day and age that we still only look at that system? And I know that there's an evolving field of psychoneuroendocrinology. Sorry, it's a combination of psychology, immunology, endocrinology, and neurology. And she admitted, she's like, yeah, there are lots of holes in our understanding of the body and of the immune system. And it's like they basically attach themselves to what they think they know because it helps them explain the philosophy behind vaccines. But ultimately, it's missing a huge picture. And we're still kind of, I would say, completely outdated and obsolete, considering what we know about the nature of reality, the nature of the human body, the fact that, we're working on frequencies, on vibrations, that everything is connected. I mean, with the gut-brain barrier, we only discovered in the last 15 years, but vaccinology hasn't really evolved to follow the times. It's layers of assumptions again, and assumptions that have are very old assumptions.
And if they really realized that, when you really, if you really, they really, these immunologists, if they really understood immunology, they would know that in a real infection, like that, if you get the flu or you get pertussis, that how your body gets rid of that infection is a dance between the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. And the antibodies that show up to the infection process are late to the game. They're like the cleanup crew. Like after you've already had the cytokines and the white blood cells and all of these things that have neutralized the virus or the bacteria and have come in, and they were the fire department, that they cut down on the heat. They did all the different things with cytokines and react and lowering the reactability. And it's the antibodies that have come in. It's almost like they're the cleanup crew after the house is already burnt down, and they clean everything up, and then they say, okay, we remember this, so that if this shows up in the neighborhood again, we don't have to go through this again because we'll remember this. And what immunology tries to do is put the antibodies on the front end of that and keep you from having the fire in the first place. And many of the antibodies that are created are to synthetic particles. They're not even to the real pathogen that's out there in the environment that you may become exposed to. I mean, the whole idea of immunology and what they teach and what is reality, when you start looking at textbooks and digging through it, they don't match at all. And the pro-vaccine people, like what you were saying, that the whole concept of immunology and vaccinology hasn't progressed in 200 years. And most of the pro-vaccine people, they hang their hat on a 1998 study that was retracted. And it's like, have you read anything else besides that or since that time? Do you understand anything else that has gone on in the last 40 years? Or are you just talking about that because you don't have anything else to hang your hat on? I think that's what it comes down to.
Absolutely. And then I mean, especially someone like me who doesn't have a PhD after my name, when you ask those questions of people who should be able to answer at least either, oh, we don't know, or we're still, exploring different avenues, a lot of people get defensive. Now, this immunology teacher I had in Oxford was really humble, actually. She was great. Like, I would have loved to have more classes with her because she seemed open to the idea, like, listen, there are things we still don't know. There's a lot of things we have to discover, and yeah, our knowledge is limited. I mean, you think of all the metabolic pathways and all the ways that we don't understand how vaccines are excreted in the body still. We don't do those distribution studies, those pharmacokinetic studies, which are obligatory for pharmaceuticals, but not for vaccines. And we don't do any testing to see if they can create cancer, or if they can create mutagenesis, all these things which are standard for pharmaceuticals, we don't look at for vaccines. They're just given like a free pass. And now the cancer epidemic, is and rare diseases as high as ever, you'd think that's a logical thing you would go and do is like, okay, let's go and do a retrospective study or prospective study. You can follow people for 5 to 10 years. I mean, nowadays cancers are developing much quicker than they used to. And let's see, do we understand the pathways that are maybe contributing to developments of cancer in these younger populations and the types of cancer, like leukemia, especially, because in the historical research, the three main side effects or the three main systems affected is the nervous system, the cardiovascular, and the blood. I guess the cardiovascular is the blood system, sorry, but like I would say blood diseases, poisoning of the blood comes up a lot in from smallpox vaccine to the present day combination vaccines. And we don't understand why or how. So let's look at this scientifically with humility to try and understand what's going on. But I think the problem why they don't want to do that is because if they did, they realize, well, we have a lot of problems with vaccines. And if it is really just about better health and preventing infections, there are probably other ways to do it. And as you said, like Suzanne Humphreys has got pissed off when she realized how easy pertussis was to treat in a 7-year-old. I've seen an example of a 5-week-year-old who had pertussis, which is, the scary age where you're told it's too young to get vaccines, so you're not protected. And this kid did really well. She had Chinese medicine, so she had herbs to prevent any inflammation. Her mother was breastfeeding but avoided anything inflammatory from a nutrition standpoint, so no dairy products, no gluten. And then she also had antibiotics from the pediatrician. And like literally after 2 weeks, the pediatrician didn't know what to do. She's like, well, usually at this point they were in hospital. So whatever you're doing, continue doing it. But she wasn't interested in finding out what else she was doing that made this 5-week-old have a very reasonable case of pertussis. Had a little bit of a cough and yeah, a couple of difficult nights, but nothing serious. It was an infection she was able to overcome and now has lifelong immunity, which no vaccine can give you lifelong immunity. And that's the other thing. We are trading off, disease infections coming later in life or creating other problems. Uh, so there's a lot of problem behind the science of vaccinology, and I think that's why there's so like the vaccinology, the pro-vaccine people are so adamantly defending it because they know that when they go down the path and they actually look at the science and they step back with humility, there's all kinds of problems, and it's coming to the forefront now. I mean, we're seeing with Aaron Siri, with what's going on in the US, with Kennedy's work with HHS, and the backlash that he's getting for what he's, there's just science. I mean, people are calling him anti-science because he dares to question, which is ironic.
Yeah, it really, isn't it though? What were some of your biggest challenges to your research to finding these things?
The biggest, I said, some of the biggest challenges was simply taking the time necessary to delve deep into these subjects. Like this, I mean, this course in Oxford was 1 week full time. Doing the research in the National Archives and the British Library, it's again just making time. But honestly, there weren't that many obstacles. I definitely had obstacles when I tried to have conversations with people who were in science because they wouldn't want to talk with me because I didn't have a PhD after my name or I wasn't a doctor. But I've come to discover even people have two PhDs. If they bring up the wrong questions, it doesn't matter how qualified they are, people would not want to talk to them about this. So sometimes, like, I wanted to just ask questions and get to the bottom of like, well, where's your thinking at? You know, you've studied vaccines. Well, how do you think that measles vaccine is the safe option to go? These were the kinds of blockages I would say that I came across the most as opposed to actually the pure research, which was just a question of, making the time and money available to actually go and spend time in the libraries in one, like swift kind of timing to not break up my research. Because every time I came back to it, I had to like pick it up, where was I, et cetera, et cetera. But and then the freedom of information request, that is an obstacle as well, because like as I said, I couldn't get access to some of the work compensation scheme reports about staff in the hospitals who were sick after vaccination. But that's just, you have to be patient, unfortunately. Like I could get access to the documents from the 80s and maybe now to the 90s, but there's always going to be like a lag, if you will, in documentation. So but anybody who's interested in researching this themselves, you'd be surprised. There aren't that many obstacles, but the conversations with people involved in public health might be the biggest obstacle because they're not open to real conversations. And that's sad because science should always be about open discourse, should never be about, silencing dissent or silencing a critic. For me, that's a sure sign that we're putting all our eggs in one basket, hoping that consensus will just shut everyone up and no one will ask questions. But we're past that, I think, nowadays.
You being from the UK, and this is where all the vaccine stuff started with Jenner, right? With the smallpox vaccine. And we had small little apothecaries in the past, and they have converted into these mammoth biotech and pharmaceutical industries. How did that happen? How did we go from really truly care one-on-one, and particularly with homeopathy, which is very symptom and very it's personalized medicine, into this one size fits all multi-gazillion dollar industry?
Well, it's interesting when you follow that as for sure. Like a lot of these companies, even Merck started out as a humble like apothecary, working with herbs, working with local plants, botanists, sorry. And in Switzerland as well, because we have such a strong pharmaceutical industry. Also, their background was also in herbs and homeopathy. Now, the Industrial Revolution obviously changed that, along with the coal tar industry, petroleum. Mr. Rockefeller, thank you very much for Standard Oil. and the mass production where they saw profit. Now, this usually came in when the synthetic age came in. So when these coal tar-based products came in, like Boris Wellcome was the first company to make tabloids, they were called, which were tablets of compressed powders. They were one of the first companies to be able to mass produce their product and see profit for it. Now, again, you got to remember back in the days, they could sell whatever they wanted and put any claims they wanted without any scientific backup. I mean, we're selling heroin as a non-addictive cough syrup for kids, for God's sake, back in these ages. So the Industrial Revolution definitely changed the way that businesses looked at health. It was a profit, started looking at profit as opposed to just, hey, we have the herbs that we can help you with your symptoms of your infections, etc. And then with the Industrial Revolution evolving with the biotech industry that came along in the 1970s, huge markets, and there was legislation as well that facilitated certain mass production of goods, especially pharmaceutical goods. Insurance companies coming into existence in the early 20th century as well influenced the way people looked at health, the way that people would take medication. It was, back in the days, it was kind of often, I would say, like also the what do you call it? Sorry, the when they were trying to kill off all the ladies, all the women, the witch trials, the Salem witch trials, for instance, was often the herb ladies, those who knew how to treat using natural
Wives in the natural
products.
places, yeah. Well, unfortunately, Shaz, we're out of time for today.
Sorry.
No, we could talk on for hours because your book is amazing, and I really want to encourage everyone to pick up a copy of this book. And it's heavy. There is so much in there. It's a heavier type of print and paper. It is something anybody that's interested in anything to do with vaccines need to have this on their shelf. Where is the best place that people can go to get a copy of your book?
So you can get my copy from Barnes and Nobles, from Amazon, obviously. I also really want to support local bookstores. So if you have a local bookstore, order it in because it's available through the distribution networks in the US and in Europe. It's just unfortunately not available in Australia, I believe, and in New Zealand, but you can get a digital version. And if you can't find a copy, feel free to reach out. The website is theultimatevaccinetimeline.com.
Very good. Are you on social media?
I'm not very social media. I started a Substack not so long ago called indieresearcher.substack.com, where I post some articles about vaccines and health as well. But I'm a bit social media shy, I'm afraid. But you can reach me through the website, and that's pretty much it, really. I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter. I mean, X. Yeah.
Well, I think that getting a copy of this book is really important. Do you have plans to translate it into other languages?
Not for the time being. I mean, a lot of the research comes out of the UK libraries and from Swiss documentation, which was in German in the base. So unless there's some strong interest, I don't know for the time being. Maybe in French, but I would think I'd have to do a bit of research at the Pasteur Institute to complement it with specific information for France. But for now, it's just available in English.
Well, I think that everyone should go and get this book. This book is the most amazing book that you want to have on your bookshelf. The Ultimate Vaccine Timeline, a fact-packed history of vaccines and their matters and their makers. I said that incorrectly, and their makers. And so this is all the time that we have for today. And I want to see everybody here tomorrow at the same place, same time, 3 o'clock Eastern time at AmericaOutloud.news and iHeartRadio. You can find the follow-up on your favorite podcast platform or at dr10penny.com. You can follow me on X or Instagram at BusyDrT. I want to thank everybody for being here today. Shaz, thank you so much for your work, and thanks you so much for everything that you're doing and for being here. And so until we see you again the next time, have a great evening, everybody. Goodbye and God bless.